Lena Harris had always been drawn to the unknown. As an investigative journalist, she'd spent years unearthing long-forgotten stories and unraveling mysteries. So when she received an anonymous tip about an abandoned house deep in the woods of her small hometown, she couldn't resist. The locals whispered about the house. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was a haven for criminals. But Lena wasn't the type to buy into superstitions. She was a skeptic, and this house was just another story waiting to be uncovered. The house had been abandoned for over 2 decades, and no one seemed to know much about its original owners. Despite its dilapidated state, it sat proudly at the heart of a dense forest, isolated from civilization. The trees surrounding it grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, as if protecting the house from the outside world. Lena had rented a cabin nearby and spent the last few days gathering information. The locals were tight-lipped, but she'd managed to piece together a few clues: strange disappearances, eerie lights at night, and strange noises that could be heard from miles away. The house, it seemed, had a history far darker than she'd expected. The morning she set out to find the house, the air was thick with mist. The fog hung low in the trees, blurring her path as she made her way through the woods. The silence around her was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. After an hour of walking, the trees began to thin, and there it was. The house loomed in front of her like a decaying sentinel. Its once white paint was chipped and faded, and its windows were dark and empty, like hollow eyes. The front porch creaked under the weight of years of neglect. As Lena approached, a chill ran down her spine. It was as if the house was watching her, waiting. Ignoring the unease creeping up her back, she pulled out her camera and began snapping photos. She walked around the perimeter of the house, studying the structure. The roof sagged in places, and the wooden walls seemed to groan under the weight of time. But it was the front door that drew her attention. It was ajar, the wood warped and splintered as if something, or someone, had forced it open. Lena hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door fully open. A wave of cold air greeted her, making the hairs on her arms stand on end. She stepped inside, her flashlight illuminating the dust-covered floor. The air smelled musty, thick with the scent of decay. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. "Hello," Lena called out, though she knew there was no one here. The silence was oppressive, heavy. She moved cautiously through the house, exploring each room methodically. The furniture had long since rotted away, leaving only the barest traces of the past. In one room, a broken chair lay overturned, its wooden legs cracked. In another, a shattered mirror reflected nothing but emptiness. As Lena made her way toward the back of the house, she came across a small staircase leading down to a basement. A faint, musty smell wafted up from below. Her heart began to race. There was something about this house, something off. She couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. Still, she pressed on. This was the story she'd been waiting for. The stairs creaked under her feet as she descended into the basement. The air was damp and cold, and the narrow space was filled with old, rotting furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. But it wasn't the furniture that caught her eye. It was the floorboards. One section of the floor seemed out of place, loose, uneven. She knelt down, brushing the dust away to reveal a trapdoor. Her pulse quickened. What was hidden beneath it? With a trembling hand, she pulled on the rusted handle and lifted the door. The sight beneath her took her breath away. In the dim light of her flashlight, she saw what looked like an old stone chamber. But it wasn't just any chamber, it was a place of ritual. Symbols were carved into the stone walls, and strange objects were scattered across the floor. There were offerings, bones, feathers, and something darker. The air felt thick with an energy she couldn't explain. This was no ordinary house, and the people who had lived here had been involved in something far darker than she had imagined. Lena's curiosity burned. She stepped into the chamber, her flashlight flickering as she moved deeper. As she crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped drastically, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She heard a faint whisper, like someone calling her name. "Lena." The voice echoed through the chamber, though no one was there. Frozen, Lena scanned the room. Her breath came in short bursts, and she could feel the weight of something pressing in on her. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was alive, breathing. Suddenly, the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping Lena inside. Panic gripped her chest, and she rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pushed against it with all her strength, but it was as if an unseen force was holding it shut. "Lena." The whisper came again, closer this time. In the darkness, Lena's flashlight flickered and then went out entirely, plunging her into complete blackness. Her heart raced in her chest as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She could hear them all around her, coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very air. The house was alive. It was speaking to her, taunting her, and she was trapped in its grasp. Then, something touched her. Cold fingers brushed against her arm, sending a jolt of terror through her body. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive darkness pressing in on her from all sides. Frantically, Lena fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to light the space. But when the beam fell on the floor, her stomach turned. There, in the center of the chamber, was an open book. It was old, its pages yellowed with age, and covered in strange markings. The symbols were the same as those carved into the walls. As Lena reached for the book, her fingers brushed against something cold and wet. The ground beneath her seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. A low growl echoed from somewhere deep within the house, and the walls began to shake. Lena stumbled back, her heart racing as the whispers grew louder and more frantic. "Leave! Leave this place!" The voices chanted, growing in intensity. She could no longer ignore it. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, a vessel for something dark and ancient. The ritual in the basement had awakened something, and now it was coming for her. With a final, desperate effort, Lena hurled herself against the door, screaming as she tried to escape. The door finally gave way, and she tumbled out into the basement, gasping for breath. The house had let her go, but not without leaving its mark. Lena never spoke of what happened that night. She left Willow Creek the next morning, leaving the house behind, but the whispers stayed with her, always in the back of her mind, reminding her that some stories are better left untold.